On a cold October day in 1986, as the leaves turned brittle and the winds swept through Manhattan streets like whispers of buried secrets, the American public flipped open their newspapers and stumbled upon a list unlike any they'd seen before. It wasn't a ranking of Fortune 500 corporations or Wall Street barons. No. This was Fortune magazine's unholy tribute to the underworld, the 50 biggest mafia bosses in America. At the very top of the list sat a 75-year-old mountain of a man, Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno. The cigar-chomping mobster was dressed more for a Bronx bocce game than a boardroom, but make no mistake, in the world of rackets, he was the CEO. His face, creased by decades of street knowledge and whispered orders, stared out from under a fedora like a throwback to a deadlier era. According to law enforcement, Salerno wasn't just powerful, he was the most powerful. The Don of Dons. But, like all things in the mob, even power had an expiration date. Behind the scenes, while the feds played checkers, one man was playing chess, slowly, silently, from the shadows. His name was Vincent Gigante. They called him the Chin. And while Salerno wore the crown, Gigante was already tightening the noose. According to Fortune's October piece, Salerno had been raking in millions before he ever ascended to the Genovese throne in 1980. With hidden interests in casinos and a stranglehold on the New York cement industry, he ran his empire like a corrupt Rockefeller. 2% off every concrete deal over $2 million. That was the tax the mob collected just for letting you build a skyscraper in their city. But those days were numbered. As Salerno's name hit number 1, Gigante quietly climbed to number 19, the highest-ranking boss under 70. He was just 57 years old, a shadowy figure who rarely spoke above a whisper and never made a public move unless it was cloaked in madness or mystery. But anyone paying close enough attention could see what was happening. With Salerno headed for trial and prison, the real power of the Genovese family had already shifted to a former boxer who muttered to fire hydrants and wore a bathrobe in the streets. By the time the November winds swept through the boroughs and rustled the remaining leaves from the trees, the news had grown colder. On November 20th, 1986, the Ann Arbor News ran a piece that sounded like a funeral dirge for the American Mafia's old guard. 8 of the Mafia's ruling commission members had been convicted on racketeering charges, including the very men who, until recently, had called the shots on hits, unions, and cash. Anthony Salerno had fallen. So had Carmine Persico and Tony Corallo. The old world, with its silent codes, its unspoken rules, and its iron-fisted loyalty, was beginning to crack. Law enforcement agents, like New Jersey's Lieutenant Fred Martins, predicted chaos. The ruling heads were gone. The commission, the Mafia's board of directors, had been gutted in a single blow. "It has to destabilize it," Martins said, and destabilize it did. Informants and wiretaps painted the same picture. The smartest of the younger generation wanted no part of leadership. Tommy Gambino, son of the legendary Carlo, was mentioned as a possible successor, but he wanted out, not up. "He never did want that job," said Joseph Coffey of the New York Organized Crime Task Force. "Men like Tommy realize federal and state prosecutors are going after family heads and captains. They'd rather stay where they are." Into that vacuum, a new breed began to rise. Younger, American-born, and reckless. Men like Nel Migliore in the Lucchese family, who didn't care for tradition and were more likely to make bold, dangerous moves. Others, like Joseph Massina in the Bonanno crew, were promoted too fast, too soon, into positions they weren't ready for. But amidst this storm of uncertainty, one family stood firm, the Genovese. With Salerno shackled by the courts, all eyes turned to Vincent, the Chin Gigante. He wasn't a man who sought headlines. He was the man who rewrote the rules without anyone noticing. He had been quietly made a captain around 1975, but even then insiders knew. Chin was different. He didn't roar, he whispered, he didn't posture, He played the fool. Wandering the streets of Greenwich Village in pajamas, muttering nonsense and ducking court dates, he gave the public one image, and his enemies another. By late 1986, even federal authorities admitted it. The chin was in charge now. And in the ever-evolving chessboard of the American underworld, Vincent Gigante had just made his opening move. By the time November darkened the skies over New York, the chill wasn't just in the air. It was in the bones of every wise guy from the Bronx to Brooklyn. On November 20th, 1986, the pages of Newsday carried not just news, but an obituary. Not for a man, but for an era. In a quiet courtroom tucked inside the U.S. courthouse on Foley Square, the heart of the American Mafia, the ruling commission itself, was gutted by a single, thunderous word: guilty. It was just past noon. The forewoman, a woman in red, soft-spoken but steely-eyed, stood and delivered the verdict like a funeral toll. Anthony Salerno, guilty. Carmine Persico, guilty. Anthony Corallo, guilty. Santoro, Langella, Fornari, Scopo, Indelicato, guilty, guilty, guilty. 151 times that word echoed across the courtroom like the hammering of nails into the coffin of a dynasty. The ruling elite, the bosses of the Genovese, Colombo, Lucchese, and Bonanno families, had been convicted on a sweeping 22-count indictment. The federal government had not just attacked the Mafia, it had struck at the very nucleus, the commission that had governed Cosa Nostra since it was born in a Brooklyn restaurant 55 years earlier. Inside that courtroom, they didn't look like gangland gods. They looked like tired men in borrowed suits. Corallo, the quiet old lion of the Lucchese family, sat with his head slumped to one side, eyes barely open. Salerno, stripped of his myth, stared blankly like a pensioner waiting on a check that would never come. Even Carmine, the snake Persico, who had acted as his own attorney with the pride of a dying emperor, had to break rank and shuffle out with the rest, the heavy chains of justice clinking at his ankles. The convictions were a bloodletting, not just in a legal sense, but in the soul of the five families. The charges weren't petty. These men had conspired to bleed the city's concrete industry, extracting $1.5 million in protection money from construction companies. They had mediated disputes in million-dollar loan-sharking rackets. And in Anthony Indelicato's case, they had sanctioned the assassination of Carmine Gigante, a murder carried out in broad daylight, under the Brooklyn sun, with a cigar still dangling from Gigante's lips. What destroyed them wasn't bullets or betrayals. It was wiretaps. From a bug in a Chrysler sedan that Corallo used to travel Long Island roads. From a wire in Salerno's East Harlem social club. From secret recordings made in the homes and cars of soldiers who didn't know their own words would be used to entomb them. One tape sealed their fate. Salerno muttering to Corallo, "I'm going to get pinched." Corallo agreed. "You pick 'em and you kill 'em." He survived. But we do it. They knew it was coming. They just didn't know when. Even as the verdicts fell, defense lawyers stumbled out onto the courthouse steps, in disbelief, their words half frozen by defeat. "I've just been steamrolled," one said. "The verdict was totally inconsistent with the evidence," said another. But no one listened. Not outside. Not anymore. Back inside, Judge Richard Owen didn't mince words. He ordered the remaining free defendants immediately jailed, rejecting house arrest. "Nothing stops," he said coldly. "Even in jail, nothing stops." And he was right. Because while the federal government stood triumphant over the fallen bosses of a crumbling regime, there was one name the prosecutors barely touched. One man who remained not only free, but untouchable. Vincent Gigante. The chin. Even before Salerno's conviction, law enforcement officials admitted what everyone in the street already knew. The Genovese family was being run not by the bloated Don in federal custody, but by the spectral presence in Greenwich Village who wandered the sidewalks in slippers, talking to fire hydrants and pretending not to know what day it was. They called him crazy. They said he was too far gone to run anything. And yet, nothing in the Genovese family happened without his blessing. While Persico raged in courtrooms and Corallo whispered in wiretapped cars, Gigante moved like smoke, unseen but everywhere. He had been made a captain back in the 1970s, but in truth he had always been something more, the quiet architect behind a fortress that no prosecutor could breach. As one generation of mob leadership fell to Rico's wrath, the Chin's reign only grew stronger. But prosecutors weren't blind. They knew this wasn't the end. "It's just the beginning," said FBI agent William Doran. "The commission is gone, but the families remain." And what happens when the old order is shattered? The young and hungry take over. Men like John Gotti. Men who didn't want to mediate with rivals, but to gun them down. Men who traded tradition for flash, who put cameras before omerta. The ruling commission, the council that for decades had held the Mafia, together with a blend of diplomacy, threat, and blood, had been reduced to a memory. A new, more chaotic era was coming. One with more violence, more instability, more blood in the streets. And at the heart of it all, quietly watching, was Vincent Gigante, the last of the old masters, playing a long game in silence, wrapped in madness, but never truly mad. By late November 1986, the Mafia's top brass had been dragged into the light. But Vincent Gigante, the Chin, remained a ghost, slipping through the cracks of courtroom chaos like a wraith who thrived in the smoke of confusion. The newspapers kept piling up like the leaves on the streets of Sullivan Street. Tallahassee Democrat, Winston-Salem Journal, Rock Island Argus. All of them told the same story. The Mafia Commission, long thought untouchable, had finally been broken apart by the justice system. The dominoes were falling. The Gambinos, the Colombos, the Luccheses, the Bonanos, the indictments, the tapes, the trials, all of it had thrown organized crime into a state of disarray. But while the commission burned, one family remained strangely calm, like the eye of a hurricane. The Genovese family. Even before Anthony Salerno's conviction, law enforcement insiders had whispered the truth. The real boss was Vincent Gigante. He was 56, but he carried the gravity of generations. A former boxer turned mob tactician, Gigante had been groomed by Vito Genovese himself, raised not just to be a soldier, but to be a strategist. The kind of man who didn't need to shout. The kind of man who didn't need the spotlight. He played a long game. He walked the streets of Greenwich Village in a bathrobe, muttering nonsense to lampposts, mumbling gibberish to passing officers. The press called him crazy. Investigators weren't so sure. "It's a pose," said Lieutenant Remo Franceschini. "He has a lot of respect in the family. There's no doubt he's running it." He was the only emissary, the only street boss, that law enforcement considered a virtual certainty to ascend to full control. In fact, they believed he already had. The others? Temporary caretakers, placeholders. In the wake of the commission trial, the power vacuum was everywhere. In the Gambino family, John Gotti, fresh off the murder of Paul Castellano, had installed his brother Peter and his childhood friend Angelo Ruggiero as go-betweens. But the FBI was already closing in, and Gotti's empire teetered on instability. Over in the Bonanno family, an aging and ailing Philip Rastelli passed control to Joseph Messina, a man with more ambition than experience. Messina had only been a captain for 4 years, and was already being whispered about as the next man to break omerta. The Colombos were adrift too. Persico had tapped Joseph Brancato, a distant relative, but no one respected Brancato, and even his own men were waiting for a chance to move. The Lucchese family was in no better shape. Corallo handed the reins to Agnello Migliore, but Migliore's reputation was that of a quiet survivor, not a kingmaker. His American-born roots made the old guard nervous. He was the kind of man who might shoot first and ask questions later, not out of cruelty, but out of inexperience. And still, the Genovese family endured. The Chin didn't just survive, he flourished. By December, the talk in law enforcement circles wasn't about who had fallen, but about who would rise. 1987 was being called the year of the jockeys, the time when every Mafia family would race to install a new leader before someone else put a bullet in the back of their head. The Rock Island Argus published a wire report from Selwyn Raab, the veteran New York Times crime journalist, who described the chaos as a watershed year in the making. The old bosses were going to federal prison. The young bloods were sniffing at the throne, jockeying for position, watching, waiting. But not Gigante. Gigante didn't play a jockey. He moved. Quietly, confidently, through emissaries and whispers and nods in smoky backrooms. The federal task forces were watching. The Bureau, under its new New York director Thomas Scheer, had shifted all focus to labor racketeering, construction, concrete, unions. Through control of unions, extortion and intimidation, mobsters took over parts of entire industries, Scheer said. Those days are over. But the Genovese family wasn't like the others. They didn't showboat. They didn't stage bloody coups in steakhouse lobbies. They were quiet, institutional, bureaucratic. And at the top of that machine was a man pretending to be a lunatic. Vincent the Chin Gigante had survived a murder indictment in 1957 when Frank Costello took a bullet to the head and lived. He'd served time for narcotics in 1959 and walked out stronger. Now, nearly 3 decades later, he had outlasted bosses, bullets, betrayals, and the full weight of the federal government. He was running the most stable family in American organized crime, from a bathrobe. He was the only one still standing while everyone else was falling. He was the last Don of the old world. And in the chaos of the Commission's collapse, Vincent Gigante's silent empire was only growing stronger. As the new year dawned over New York City in January 1987, it didn't feel like a fresh beginning. It felt like a hangover after the wake of the Mafia Commission, whose last rites had been read in a courtroom months earlier. On paper, 4 of the most powerful Mafia bosses in the nation had each been sentenced to 100 years in prison. Fat Tony Salerno of the Genovese family, Tony Dux Corallo of the Lucchese, Carmine Persico, and Jerry Langella of the Colombo. Together, they represented nearly a century of underworld leadership. And now they were caged like relics of a dying empire. But make no mistake, the Mafia wasn't dead. At Kennedy Airport, on the piers, in the concrete shadowlands of the Garment District, the money still moved. Dozens of streams flowed into the mob's coffers: heroin, gambling, stolen goods, Super Bowl bets. The machine hadn't stopped, but something had changed. The engine room had gone dark. The men who once settled blood feuds over espresso at Don Pepe's were now confined to concrete boxes, hundreds of miles from their turf, stripped of their reach. And into that void, in quiet, calculated steps, walked Vincent Gigante. They called him the Chin, and he didn't take power with a gun or a press conference. He didn't have to. While the press gawked at John Gotti's flashy suits and courtroom antics, Gigante strolled Sullivan Street in a bathrobe, muttering like a lunatic, ducking subpoenas by pretending not to understand the English language, or any language at all. But every law enforcement expert worth his badge knew the truth. Gigante wasn't a madman. He was a maestro. On January 1st, the Daily Herald ran a feature by Selwyn Raab, the New York Times authority on organized crime. The title may as well have read, "The Last Don Standing." While the other bosses named street captains or reluctant emissaries to hold the reins, men like Peter Gotti, Victor Orena, Agnello Migliore, Vincent Gigante didn't ask for control. He took it because it had already been his. He had been Vito Genovese's protégé, his chosen heir in a family built on silence, structure, and surgical violence. Gigante had survived a federal narcotics conviction. He had beaten an attempted murder charge after Frank Costello, shot in the head, refused to identify him. He had turned madness into armor, a sham so convincing that even some of his own soldiers didn't know where the act ended and the power began. "He has a lot of respect in the family," said Lieutenant Remo Franceschini. "There is no doubt he is running it." In a city cracking under the weight of surveillance and indictments, the Genovese family alone remained stable. And that was no accident. Gigante knew the rules had changed. The age of whispers and winks had been replaced by wiretaps and witnesses. The new bosses were younger, brasher, and dumber. Gigante didn't posture. He played dead and ruled like a ghost king. 2 weeks after the sentences came down, the Taylorville Daily Breeze Courier laid it bare. If you take the seat, you're in the heat. Experts like Howard Aberdinsky and Ronald Goldstock agreed. The Mafia's mechanism for peace, its internal commission, had been crippled. Replacing it would be nearly impossible. The men left behind were green, greedy, and often reckless. The new commission, such as it would be staffed by strangers. No shared wars, no old blood pacts, no decades of knowing when to hold back a hit or broker a deal. They were gangsters raised on television, not tradition. Gotti was a celebrity don. Rastelli was a dying man. Gravano, still years away from betrayal, was rising in the Gambino ranks. But none of them had what Gigante had: the loyalty of a family, the brain of a tactician, and the power of mystery. Meanwhile, in the shadows. While Gigante quietly consolidated his hold over the Genovese family, others found themselves tangled in petty dramas that only underscored the decline of mob discipline. On January 18th, the Daily News broke a bizarre story. A plot to bribe a federal prison guard with $25,000 to assist in an escape attempt involving a mobster imprisoned on the 9th floor of the Metropolitan Correctional Center, a tier reserved for mafia figures. The alleged conspirator? Deborah Napoli, the granddaughter of 74-year-old James Jimmy Napoli, a semi-retired Genovese capo who once ran the largest gambling racket in New York. The plan was almost cinematic: smuggle in a portable TV, bribe the guard, and tamper with prison records by removing a detainer card, the very notice that prevented an inmate from walking out on bail. The target, unknown. The method, sloppy. The scheme unraveled before it could even start. But it was a symbol of the times. A new generation, sloppy and entitled, replacing the old with bribes and gadgets instead of brains and blood. Even inside the MCC, the Mafia had lost its class. Just weeks earlier, a veal cutlet hero meant for John Gotti was intercepted before it reached his cell. If Gotti was the new face of the Mafia, then the old guard had truly gone. But not its Antachin. Because while others groped in the dark, Vincent Gigante was already there, watching. From the alleys of Greenwich Village to the corridors of federal power, he stayed hidden in plain sight. The last real boss. The man the others feared more than the FBI. He didn't want your attention. He wanted your silence. And in 1987, as the Mafia stumbled into a new and dangerous era, Vincent Gigante sat quietly on his throne. Cloaked in madness, sharpened by experience, and untouched by the storm. By the winter of 1987, Vincent, the Chin Gigante, had become less of a man and more of a myth, if you believed the headlines. To the public, he was a lunatic in a bathrobe. To law enforcement, he was the most powerful mobster in America. And to the underworld, he was the last of a dying breed, The man you went to when things needed fixing, silencing, or vanishing. He didn't storm into power with bullets or bribes. He wandered into it. Literally. Down Sullivan Street, his hulking frame wrapped in flannel, slippers scuffing against the pavement, eyes blank, lips moving in disconnected phrases. It was all part of the performance, a theatre of madness meant to insulate him from subpoenas, indictments, and the fate that had befallen every other major boss in New York. But those who had been watching him for decades knew the truth. "He's not fooling anybody," one state prosecutor told the Daily News on January 25, 1987. "He's putting us off the scent." And what a scent it was. Nearly 40 years earlier, Gigante had been fingered as the triggerman in the botched 1957 assassination of Frank Costello, the old-school racketeer who had grown too soft, too public, too content. The bullet only grazed Costello's scalp, and his famous reply, "I didn't see nothing," ensured that Chin walked. But that bullet had spoken louder than any courtroom testimony. It said, Vito Genovese had won the war, and Vincent Gigante, his personal bodyguard, was no longer just muscle. He was a made man with purpose. Over the next 3 decades, Gigante built a reputation not through flash, but through fear. He ran numbers, extorted unions, and rose to captain within the Genovese family by the early 1970s. According to intelligence reports, by the time the ailing Philip Lombardo retreated to Florida, Gigante, alongside Fat Tony Salerno and Luis Manna, was forming a shadow triumvirate at the top of the family. But only one of them was destined to rule. Only one of them had the patience, the paranoia, and the pedigree to outlast them all. By 1983, New Jersey State Police were calling him the acting boss. Fortune magazine, in a rare glimpse into the dark economy of crime, ranked him number 19 among America's most powerful mobsters, higher than any active member not yet under indictment or behind bars. And that was before the dominoes fell. Behind the spectacle of Chin's madness lay a family fortified in silence and in blood. His brother, Mario the Shadow Gigante, was no stagehand. He was the enforcer, the man you didn't see until it was too late. In testimony delivered to the New York State Assembly, a garbage hauler turned informant named Harold Kaufman recalled a meeting gone dark. It was the late 1970s. Kaufman's company had underbid the Mongeli family, longtime Genovese-tied waste contractors, for a lucrative Ford plant job in Mahwah, New Jersey. That violation of the unspoken first hauler code sparked a mob war in the trash industry. It ended in a sit-down. On one side, Kaufman and his boss. On the other, Mario Gigante. According to testimony, Gigante didn't raise his voice. He raised a gun. "Unless you give up the Ford stop," Kaufman remembered him saying, "you are a dead man." The man handed over the route. That was how the Gigantes did business. Without press, without mercy, and without a second warning. Their fingerprints were all over the sanitation industry, from the Bronx to Rockland County to the infamously toxic Penaluna landfill in Orange County. In fact, state regulators would later accuse Mongeli-controlled companies, backed by Genovese muscle, of contaminating drinking water for nearly 1 million people. Toxic waste, route intimidation, fire bombings, and even a mysterious murder. The 1976 shotgun slaying of a witness's elderly mother-in-law on her front doorstep. No one was ever charged, but insiders didn't need a court to connect the dots. The message had been sent. The silence had been preserved. And at the center of that web, visible only to those who knew where to look, was Vincent, the Chin Gigante. As 1987 grounded on, the city's 5 families were fractured. The bosses were either dead, dying, or destined for life in federal prisons hundreds of miles from their turf. Gotti may have stolen headlines, but his flashy style put a target on his back. Gravano, Then his loyal street boss was still years away from betrayal. But Chin? Chin was different. He didn't appear on wiretaps. He didn't rant in court. He didn't chase celebrity or carry himself like a king. He shuffled like a ghost through the village, his mind unfit, his body frail, his brother a priest, and his enemies silenced. The commission may have collapsed. The old order may have crumbled. But in a city of chaos and clashing street bosses, only one figure still commanded the reverence of the old world and the fear of the new. The Chin wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. He was power in its purest form, quiet, cunning, and untouchable. By the Ides of March 1987, Vincent the Chin Gigante was no longer just a rumor in a bathrobe or a legend in the gutter press. He was the boss. Not just of the Genovese family, but according to federal law enforcement, the most powerful man in all of Cosa Nostra. While John Gotti stole headlines with his Brioni suits and swaggering strut, the real power in New York shuffled up and down Sullivan Street in slippers, mumbling to himself in the dead of night. Gigante, now 59, wasn't just running a crime family. He was overseeing a machine, an institution that had weathered the collapse of the commission, outlasting dozens of arrests, and avoided the public spectacles that had engulfed the Gambinos. In a city where every other boss had either been murdered, imprisoned, or exposed, the Chin remained a ghost in the machine, untouched, unindicted, and underestimated. "He's clearly the most powerful guy in the Genovese family," said Edward McDonald, head of the organized crime strike force in Brooklyn, "and maybe the most powerful in the entire country." Gigante's path to the top hadn't been paved with press conferences or assassinations. It had been quiet, deliberate, like a shadow slipping into a throne. He had spent decades just outside the frame, chauffeur, bodyguard, silent ear in the room when Frank Costello ran the family. When Vito Genovese issued the order to eliminate Costello in 1957, it was Gigante who carried the gun. The bullet grazed Costello's scalp, but did the job. The old boss retired. Gigante walked from the charges, and the message was delivered. Genovese now ruled, and Gigante was his man. By 1959, Gigante was convicted alongside Genovese in a massive international heroin operation. He served less than 4 years. By the time he got out, Genovese was dying in prison, and Gigante was on the rise. Through Salerno and Lombardo, through whispers and blood ties, he climbed, but never loudly. He learned the one truth that mattered in the underworld. The quieter you are, the longer you live. "He's a stand-up old-time gangster," one state expert said, "and he's earned the respect and loyalty of his bosses, his soldiers, and guys in other families." Where Gotti was flashy, Gigante was foggy. Where Gotti played the crowd, Gigante played the clock. Investigators knew the difference. They'd seen it all before. "He's a lot savvier than Gotti," one source told Newsday. "He knows how complex organizations work. He learned from Vito Genovese, from Tony Salerno. He doesn't go to war. He mediates. He doesn't shout. He whispers." And while Gotti had to patch together a fractured Gambino family still bleeding from the assassination of Paul Castellano, Gigante's Genovese crew remained intact. Strong middle management, loyalty unshaken, operations running smoothly. There was no scramble for power, no blood in the streets, no cameras outside Ravenite social clubs. Just the Chin, mumbling at 3 a.m., ducking the feds with a bathrobe and a blank stare. "He conducts business late, to avoid surveillance," one investigator noted. "He's sharp. He plays pinochle like a savant. He knows how to make you look at the wrong hand while he wins the game." It was all part of the act. The bathrobe, the mumbling, the court-documented psychiatric episodes, the 1970 bribery case in Old Tappan, New Jersey, dismissed after psychiatrists testified that Gigante was a paranoid schizophrenic plagued by hallucinations. Charges dropped, case closed. It wouldn't be the last time he used madness as a shield. Even now, as the FBI targeted him as their #1 priority, Gigante's brother, the Reverend Louis Gigante, a Bronx priest and former city councilman, insisted the Don was mentally unbalanced. "A very sick man who never did anything wrong," he told reporters. "He will soon be committed to an institution." But the feds weren't buying it. "Nobody's fooled," one agent said flatly. "He's trying to get us to take him off the hit list, but he's now the major target of law enforcement." In a city crawling with bosses who burned fast and died faster, Vincent Gigante was something different. He was a student of history, a man who studied Luciano, Genovese, and Costello like scripture. He knew how to command respect, not demand it. He knew how to keep his hands clean and his fingerprints invisible. He knew how to disappear in daylight. Thomas Scheer, head of the FBI's New York office, put it best. Who else has been around for 40 years? Only the Chin. He was the godfather who never smiled for the camera, the killer who never got caught, the Don who wore madness like a mask, and wore it so well it became a myth. But behind that myth was a mind as sharp as a knife, as cold as concrete, and as calculating as any boardroom strategist Wall Street ever produced. Vincent Gigante wasn't just surviving the modern mob war. He was winning it. And nobody saw him coming, because he made sure they looked away. By the spring of 1987, the Mafia in America looked less like the feared shadow government of old and more like a broken cartel gasping through its worst year in history. Gone were the days of whispered sit-downs and silent, bloody resolutions. Now came subpoenas, wiretaps, and the ultimate betrayal, testimony. And as the once sacred codes of omerta crumbled under the weight of courtroom oaths, one truth emerged above the chaos. The mob had been cracked wide open, from the inside. They called it the commission case, but what it really was the funeral of an era. Men like Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, Anthony Tony Ducks Corallo, and Carmine Jr. Persico had ruled like CEOs of a criminal empire stretching from concrete unions in Manhattan to heroin trails carved through Sicily and Turkey. They didn't just control crime. They organized it, managed it, taxed it. And they did it through fear, through muscle, and through a corporate-style council that brokered peace, sanctioned hits, and divided billions like blue-chip shares. Until the bugs got in. Hidden microphones inside cars, clubhouses, even old phone booths outside pizzerias. They recorded everything. Salerno boasting from his Harlem clubhouse that if it wasn't for me, there wouldn't be no mob left. Corallo, disgusted by insubordination, growling, "You shoot them! Get rid of them." Scopo, the cement union racketeer, leaning on construction tycoons like a capo in pinstripes, squeezing 2% from every multi-million-dollar project. They called it the club. But it was extortion at scale. And the trials, oh, the trials, were spectacles never seen before. There was Pizza Connection, a 17-month odyssey through the heroin-stained ledger of the Sicilian Mafia. There was Commission, where the unthinkable happened. The Mafia's secret government stood exposed before the eyes of 12 ordinary jurors. And there were the others, like the case that nearly took down John Gotti nearly. But not even the Teflon Don could steal the spotlight from what the Justice Department was pulling off. In a single year, they dismantled every single boss of New York's 5 families, and yet one name remained untouched. While the rest of the underworld staggered beneath RICO indictments and leaked testimony, Vincent the Chin Gigante, the bathrobe-wearing ghost of Sullivan Street, only grew stronger. Lawmen had heard it all before he was mumbling, unfit, mentally broken. But they weren't fooled, not anymore. Thomas Scheer, head of the FBI's New York office, cut through the fog. He's been around for 40 years. Who else has? Not Gotti, not Rastelli, not even Persico. Only the Chin. Behind the facade of madness was a brain wired like a general's. Investigators said he worked late into the night, conducting business at 3 or 4 in the morning to avoid surveillance. He ran the Genovese family not through bravado, but through stability. No bloodbaths, no press conferences, no flashy suits. Just loyalty, longevity, and leverage. "He's very sharp," one state investigator said. "He doesn't go to war. He mediates. He doesn't shout. He whispers." And when he whispered, even other families listened. But if Gigante was the last link to the old world of omerta and silent obedience, the mafia around him was mutating. The wiretaps and testimonies didn't just expose names, they laid bare the inner culture of the mob, a generation gap cleaving the old-school loyalists from the fast-talking, drug-running, flashier soldiers of the 1980s. This was no longer the era of Luciano's street diplomacy. This was globalization, Mafia style, with Swiss bank accounts, with narco routes mapped from Palermo to Pittsburgh, with pizza parlors doubling as heroin hubs. As Thomas Shear put it, the mob had gone the way of corporate America, but they break legs when they lose. From the garbage industry in New Jersey to concrete unions in Manhattan to heroin ports in Brooklyn, the mob's reach was vast, but vulnerable. In Kansas City, Philadelphia, Boston, New Jersey, indictments tore through operations like wildfire. And in New York, Giuliani's campaign against corruption scorched the myth of mafia invincibility. "They've always been just a street gang," Giuliani said flatly. "Spiritually, psychologically, that's all they are." The revelations came with irony and absurdity. Mobsters who demanded clean-shaven faces and pressed suits. Wise guys who banned swearing in front of women but smashed skulls with hammers. Hitmen who paused for Mother's Day, and in one infamous wiretap, a soldier mocking Salerno to his face as Fat Tony. A breach of respect so intolerable, even Salerno moaned about retirement. "I don't know what to do," he told Corallo on tape. "I made all these guys. I worked myself. Geez, how could a man be like that?" "You shoot him," Corallo replied. "But you can't go on. It's disgusting." The rot had spread from within. The mafia that entered 1987 was not the same force that dominated New York in the post-war years. The bosses were gone. The commission was shattered. The names were familiar: Lucchese, Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese. But their leadership was either in prison or on borrowed time. Even Gotti, with his courtroom escape, was still on the ropes. Rastelli was dying. Persico was locked away. Salerno would never again breathe free air. But the chin? He walked. Bathrobe, slippers, and all. They said he was crazy. But in a year where every other don fell, maybe being crazy was the smartest move of all. By the summer of 1987, the lines between high art and hard crime had never been blurrier. On the surface, Maurice Levy was a music mogul, 60 years old, silver-haired, sharply dressed, and as polished as a showroom piano. The man had rubbed shoulders with Sinatra and Miles Davis, ran the legendary Birdland nightclub, sat on the board of the Boston Opera Company, and helped raise millions for the United Jewish Appeal. He was, in the words of his own attorney, a leading businessman in the recording industry. But behind the marble offices, velvet curtains and gold records on the wall, Levy was allegedly tethered to something far more dangerous than the music charts. According to the FBI, he belonged to Vincent Gigante. In a sealed affidavit later made public in a Camden courtroom, federal agent Lawrence Ferreira detailed what law enforcement had long suspected: that Levy, despite his suits and society ties, was under the control by threats of force from the most elusive and powerful mob boss in America. Vincent, the Chin Gigante. Gigante, they claimed, had turned Levy's music empire into a cash faucet for the Genovese crime family. The federal affidavit read like a noir script. Vincent Gigante has developed a stranglehold on Maurice Levy's recording industry enterprise, Ferreira wrote, turning Levy into a source of ready cash for the Genovese LCN family. Wiretaps, confidential informants, secret transactions, even whispered threats of death. And it didn't stop at Levy. The feds had widened their net from New York to Los Angeles. There were whispers of counterfeit records, mob control of record distribution, and secret shares in retail chains like Strawberries, a 60-store empire that, according to informants, helped finance real estate deals for Gigante's crew. One source claimed bluntly that Levy had only one way out: death. Gigante, they said, had threatened to kill him. Levy scoffed. Pure bullshit, he called the whole thing when questioned by the press. I've been on Broadway 47 years. I know some of these characters, and some I like very much. I knew Cardinal Spellman too. That don't make me a Catholic. But the government had receipts. They said it began decades earlier, before 1963, when Levy still ran Birdland. According to the Bureau, a mob hit meant for Levy accidentally killed his brother. Levy fled to Israel. Months later he came back. The music business carried on, but so did the mob's grip. The government said the relationship was sealed by blood and business. They claimed Levy had once partnered with Thomas Ippoliti, the Genovese boss who ruled briefly in the early 70s, on a record label. They said Levy considered himself a close friend of Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, and they insisted that since Salerno's 100-year sentence in the commission trial, it was now Gigante pulling the strings. What began as whispers was now front-page drama, that the most powerful mob boss in the country wore a bathrobe on Sullivan Street in the daytime, and by night was laundering millions through RCA quality vinyl. Levy's current legal troubles stemmed from a tangled deal involving 4 million discount records purchased from MCA Records in 1984. According to prosecutors, Levy, his comptroller Howard Fisher, and two reputed mob associates, Dominic Baldy Dom Cantarino and Gaetano Vastola, used intimidation and mob ties to muscle Derby, Pennsylvania record wholesaler John Lamonte for money. The catch? Lamonte wasn't exactly innocent. He was a confessed bootlegger. But once the screws turned, he flipped. He gave up everyone, entered witness protection, and helped build a federal indictment. MCA, one of the biggest record labels in the world, was never accused of wrongdoing. But their merchandise had become mob leverage. Levy insisted he was being set up. The whole reason I'm indicted is because I wouldn't go in the witness protection program, he snapped. His attorney, Michael Quirquess, argued something curious. If the FBI's own affidavit was to be believed, then Levy wasn't a criminal. He was a victim, controlled, extorted, under duress. That's not what we're saying, Levy muttered to reporters as he left court. It's what we're saying the FBI is saying. So what was the truth? Was Maurice Levy the grand impresario of mobbed-up music? Or just a frightened merchant forced to funnel millions into the pockets of a shadowy don who wandered the village in his slippers, pretending to be mad? Gigante remained silent, as always. And somewhere in the smoky hallways of the FBI's Manhattan office, a rack of records sat as evidence. Proof that in the world of organized crime, even the beat of a jukebox could carry the echo of a threat. In the world of organized crime, loyalty is priceless, silence is sacred, and trust is built over decades. But sometimes it all goes up in smoke. Literally. At 2 a.m. on November 12, 1984, a blacktop ballet unfolded in front of a brick house in Bensonhurst. A team of at least 8 FBI agents and 2 NYPD detectives crept toward a parked 1984 blue Cadillac, the ride belonging to one of the mob's most loyal men, Dominic Baldy Dom Cantarino, reputed capo in the Genovese crime family, and one of Vincent the Gigante's most trusted muscle men. The plan was textbook: boost the car, plant a bug, then slip it back before sunrise like nothing ever happened. But the street didn't sleep. Cantorino was up. He saw it all unfold through his front window, the caddy pulling away into the Brooklyn dark, a phantom now in enemy hands. What happened next remains a swirl of missteps and gasoline. By sunrise, the Cadillac was found torched near a fire alarm box in Staten Island, its front seats ripped out, its chassis blackened. Federal prosecutors called it insurance fraud. The FBI's version was that Cantorino had heard opportunity knocking and staged the arson to cash in. But Cantorino had his own tale. He and his son Joseph had gone looking for the car, spotted it being driven by an unknown man, and even tried ramming it off the road. The Cadillac had vanished, and less than 2 hours later it was flames and twisted metal. The fire may have burned for minutes, but the fallout lasted years. At trial, the government claimed the torching was a cover-up, a fairy tale concocted to justify a payout. But U.S. District Judge John Sprizzo wasn't buying it. He directed a verdict of acquittal, saying flat out that the evidence made more sense if the FBI had accidentally set events in motion, and possibly even burned the car themselves to cover their tracks. Sprizzo wasn't finished. He accused FBI agent Vaughn Antab of lying under oath and openly questioned the ethics of Assistant U.S. Attorney Andrew McCarthy and his predecessor Ann Vitale. When Antab hit the stand, he claimed more than 50 times that he couldn't remember what had happened that night. Sprizzo was blunt. "I am really trying not to draw that inference of willful perjury, but it is becoming harder and harder for me not to draw it." If this were a movie, the next scene would cut to Gigante, pacing Sullivan Street in his bathrobe, smiling through the chaos. He didn't need to pull strings. The feds were unraveling their own case. But Cantorino's name wasn't out of headlines for long. He was now roped into another case, this one unfolding in Camden, New Jersey. It had the sheen of the music business, but the soul of a street shakedown. At its center, Morris Levy, the so-called godfather of the record industry, owner of Roulette Records, Strawberry's retail chain, and countless other assets that fed his million-dollar empire. Levy, a man who raised money for opera houses by day and allegedly passed cash to mob captains by night, was now on trial. The FBI claimed Levy's entire music enterprise was under the thumb of the Genovese family, that he was a cash cow for Gigante's crew, willingly or not. The Camden indictment was a behemoth, 114 charges, 21 defendants, and allegations that stretched from tape counterfeiting to drug trafficking. But Judge Stanley Brotman saw a logistical nightmare. He broke the case into 7 trials. Levy, Cantorino, and Howard Fisher, Levy's accountant and longtime associate, would go first. They faced just 3 counts: extortion and conspiracy in the strong-arm sale of 4 million discount records from MCA Records to a Derby, Pennsylvania wholesaler named John Lamonti. Lamonti, a confessed record pirate with mob ties of his own, was now the government's star witness. He claimed Levy's crew had leaned on him, threatening violence if he didn't cough up money after the deal was done. Levy insisted that the case was absurd. "The only reason I'm indicted is because I wouldn't go into the witness protection program," he said defiantly. But prosecutors had wiretaps, affidavits, and a story that, if true, suggested the mob had turned America's jukebox into a cash register of extortion. Behind it all loomed the shadow of Vincent Gigante, the Chin. They said he had a piece of strawberries. They said he got regular payouts from Levy. They said the man in the bathrobe was the real boss of the music business. And Cantorino? He was the bridge between both worlds, the blunt enforcer who could shake down a record executive in the morning and negotiate union deals by lunch. Back in court, Judge Sprizzo had asked a question that lingered in the air like smoke from that Staten Island Cadillac. Does that make sense to you? When the prosecutor claimed a mob torch job happened across the street from a suspect's house, Sprizzo shook his head. Then these are the most unintelligent criminals in the history of the world. But this wasn't about intelligence. It was about power. And in 1987, the Mafia wasn't being killed by bullets. It was being choked by lawsuits, wiretaps, and the unintended consequences of its own mythology. The men once hidden behind Omerta were now coughing up secrets. The agents who once hunted them were being accused of lying under oath. In the middle of it all stood Gigante, silent, smiling, and untouchable, for now. The rules had changed. In the old days, you got a warning, maybe a sit-down, before someone came gunning for your life. But by 1982, Paul Castellano and Vincent the Chin Gigante had rewritten the playbook. Their new pact was as clear as it was cold-blooded. If you're caught pushing junk, there are no warnings, no meetings. You're dead. And for Peter, Little Pete Tambone, that meant he was already a ghost walking. Tambone wasn't a made man, just an associate, a hanger-on orbiting the inner circle of Gambino soldier Angelo Ruggiero, one of John Gotti's closest allies. But he'd made a fatal misstep. Someone ratted him out to Castellano, claiming he was selling heroin. That's all it took. A silent contract was inked in blood. Tambone was marked for execution. What saved him wasn't Omerta, it wasn't loyalty. It was the FBI. A federal agent, Arthur Ruffles, broke protocol, broke ranks, and saved a marked man by sending a warning through Tambone's wife. Somebody wants to hurt him. Tambone panicked, picked up the phone and called Ruggiero's Long Island home. Wiretaps caught every whisper. Within minutes, Ruggiero was on the horn to John Gotti. "It shows there's plenty of listening around," Gotti said. And he was right. The walls were bugged, the phones were tapped, and the rules of silence were collapsing like dominoes. Tambone was granted a stay of execution, but only after weeks of sit-downs and favours called in. Ruggiero begged Neil Della Croce, the underboss, to give Tambone a pass. Castellano reluctantly agreed, but the message was clear. Stay away from the family. "You got a pass," Ruggiero said, "but don't be hanging around nobody." In that world, a pass was a gift. But it was also a sentence of exile. You lived, but you were nothing. And yet, somewhere far from the spotlight, Vincent Gigante was watching it all from the shadows and learning. While John Gotti was riding the heatwave of flashbulbs and front-page tabloid headlines, Gigante was perfecting his greatest weapon, invisibility. In a dingy Greenwich Village walk-up on Sullivan Street, the Chin lived like a ghost in his own neighborhood. Most days he wandered the streets in a bathrobe, mumbling like a man lost in his own head. He crossed streets like a boy dodging raindrops, card games here, whispered counsel there. Always playing the fool, always playing the long game. But law enforcement knew better. "Gigante is probably the most clever organized crime figure I have seen," said John Pritchard, a former FBI man who'd tracked him for years. And he was right. While Gotti strutted in custom suits, Gigante wore windbreakers. While Gotti ate in celebrity restaurants, Gigante dined in silence. And while other bosses were being dragged into federal courtrooms, Gigante was ducking subpoenas in his bathrobe, once literally hiding under a running shower, holding an umbrella. He was crazy, the psychiatrist said, mentally unfit, paranoid, suicidal. But ask anyone in the Genovese family, and they'll laugh. Gigante wasn't crazy. He was smart. He knew the feds couldn't indict a lunatic, and if they couldn't indict him, they couldn't touch him. He wasn't just dodging bullets, he was rewriting the rules of power. By 1987, every other boss in the five families was either behind bars or in the ground. Castellano was dead. Persico was serving time. Anthony Corallo, Fat Tony Salerno, Philip Rastelli, gone, sentenced, disgraced. Gigante. Still strolling Sullivan Street, still running the Genovese family like a phantom king. And his empire wasn't just heroin and gambling. It had roots in the record business, the garment district and Wall Street. He had bookmaking rings that moved $76 million a year, stretching from Lodi, New Jersey, to Manhattan's Murray Hill. When police raided one of his betting operations, disguised inside a luxury studio apartment, they found 16 phones, 11 tape recorders, and $500,000 in Sunday receipts. The Genovese crew paid homage to Gigante. They called it what it was, a street tax, and every dollar paid, every silence kept, every whisper traded in the dark, all of it built a fortress around him. The man in the bathrobe wasn't weak. He was untouchable. But for how long? That was the question echoing through courtrooms and wiretap rooms. The feds were watching. The press was circling. And even his most trusted enforcers, guys like Dominic Cantorino, were brushing up against the law in insurance scams and record industry extortion cases. The net was tightening. Yet Gigante remained, as one agent put it, a man with his fingers in many, many pies. He had influence, he had control, and above all he had silence. Where others boasted, he whispered. Where others made noise, he vanished. Vincent Gigante wasn't just the last of the old bosses. He was the best of them. A shadow in plain sight, a madman on the surface, a ruler in the dark. In a city where mob bosses strutted like kings and demanded headlines as tribute, Vincent, the Chin, Gigante, moved like a rumor. His kingdom was not carved out with flashbulbs or bullets. It was built in shadows, cloaked in muttered conversations and midnight strolls through the streets of Greenwich Village. While John Gotti was polishing his silk ties and basking in the glow of a media spotlight, Gigante was slipping into pajamas and crossing Sullivan Street in slippers, head down, his empire hidden behind a veil of madness. To the casual eye, he looked like a man one step removed from a psych ward. Frail, confused, sometimes incoherent. On warm afternoons, he'd shuffle across the pavement into a dingy storefront, where he played cards and whispered with his most trusted lieutenants. There, in the haze of cigarette smoke and low murmurs, the genuine business was done. The act was genius. When the FBI came knocking, they didn't find a boss in a corner office or a thug with a gun tucked in his belt. They found a man hiding in plain sight, mumbling, dazed, standing naked under a running shower with an umbrella in his hand. They served him subpoenas in his mother's apartment. He greeted them like a ghost. Yet everyone who mattered in the underworld knew better. "He's not crazy," said Lieutenant Remo Franceschini of the NYPD's Organized Crime Bureau. "He's playing crazy, and they all know it." The numbers told the real story. Under Gigante's rule, the Genovese family was pulling in over $100 million a year in illicit profits, from gambling, labor, racketeering, loan sharking, and more. And yet, while the bosses of every other family were going down in handcuffs, Salerno, Persico, Rastelli, Corallo, Gigante remained untouched. "He's the most clever organized crime figure I've ever seen," said former FBI agent John Pritchard, who spent years chasing the Chin through the cracks of the city's underworld. "He's got his fingers in many, many pies." What Gigante understood better than anyone was that power isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it wears a bathrobe. And sometimes it pretends not to understand the charges being filed against it. While Gotti sat front row at the Copacabana, Gigante stuck to card tables in smoky back rooms. While Gotti handed out cash like a politician on election day, Gigante shuffled down alleys to avoid long-range microphones. He never discussed business indoors. He never made calls. If it couldn't be said face to face on a late-night walk, it didn't get said. His circle was small. His trust was earned in silence. His enemies didn't know they were in danger until it was far too late. Yet, despite his secrecy, whispers leaked. Investigators noted that Gigante rarely left New York, except to check himself into psychiatric facilities in Westchester County. When the FBI surveilled him, they saw a man completely at odds with the caricature of the modern gangster. No limousines, no pinky rings, just windbreakers, baggy trousers, and work shoes. He didn't need to be seen. Because behind closed doors, far from the press, far from courtrooms, far from Gotti's headlines, Gigante ruled what many considered the most disciplined and loyal crew in the American Mafia. By 1988, every other boss had taken a hit. The Bonanos were in chaos. The Colombos were scattered. The Luccheses were fractured. Even the Gambinos, under the brash new reign of John Gotti, were feeling the weight of federal scrutiny. But the Genovese family? They were still standing, still organized, still feared. And at the heart of it all was a silent general who walked like a patient, but thought like a warlord. "He's not the type of guy you see on the front page," said Ronald Goldstock, head of New York's organized crime task force. "But he's the one they all answer to. Some crime bosses choose the spotlight, others choose the shadows, and the ones who survive almost always choose the shadows." Vincent Gigante had turned mental illness into an alibi. He had turned paranoia into strategy. And as the FBI closed in on the last remnants of old-world Cosa Nostra, the Chin remained the one man they couldn't corner. Because how do you charge a man who doesn't know who he is? Or more dangerously, pretends not to know exactly what he's doing. By the time spring rolled into Greenwich Village in 1988, the man known as the Chin had become something of a phantom. He was more myth than mobster to the casual observer, a greying spectre in a bathrobe wandering the cracked sidewalks of Sullivan Street, mumbling to himself, shuffling in slippers, crossing to a dusty storefront with a sagging awning and a warped sign, Triangle Civic Improvement Association. But behind that modest door, beneath the fluorescent flicker and frayed chairs, Vincent Gigante held court. Not in name, but in whispers. Not with titles, but with fear. Gigante didn't need to shout commands or flash power. He was powerful. Power that kept quiet. Power that pretended not to exist. While other bosses fell like dominoes to federal indictments, Gotti, Persico, Corallo, Rastelli, the Chin floated untouched. He didn't dine at flashy restaurants or cruise the streets in limos. He didn't wear $1,000 suits or wink at reporters. His uniform was a bathrobe. His court was the back room of a club that displayed a single warning on the wall. "Don't talk. This place is bugged." And still, the business flourished. The Genovese family, under his quiet rule, operated like a machine. Gambling, loan sharking, narcotics, drywall unions, sanitation kickbacks, construction rackets, the Fulton fish market. Anywhere there was a dollar to be squeezed, they were there. And the take? Law enforcement estimated more than $100 million in annual illegal profits. The kind of money that could buy loyalty, silence, and enough insulation to make Gigante untouchable. But make no mistake, he wasn't some mystical relic, coasting on old legends. Behind the shuffled gait and whispered card games was a mind as sharp as a stiletto. A strategist, a ghost general. He avoided phones, avoided restaurants, avoided any place where bugs or snitches might be lurking. His most important meetings happened on darkened streets after midnight, walking under umbrellas even in dry weather, just in case a parabolic microphone was hidden in the shadows. "He's mindful of setting up a defense in case he's ever arrested," said former FBI agent John Pritchard. "That's why he sometimes acts strangely in public. But don't be fooled. He's probably the most clever organized crime figure I've ever seen." Even his morning routine was a riddle. Around 2 or 3 in the afternoon, Gigante would shuffle out of his mother Yolanda's walk-up at 225 Sullivan Street and make his way across the street to the Triangle Club. There, he'd play cards, occasionally slipping into hushed conversations with only his most trusted lieutenants. After midnight, he was driven uptown to a quiet townhouse at 67 East 77th Street, owned by a woman named Olympia Esposito, purchased for $490,000 in 1983. By morning, between 9 and 10, he'd returned to Sullivan Street like a ghost, clocking in for another shift. His enemies? They didn't speak his name. His friends? They called him Chin, a nickname his mother gave him, one he carried like a badge of blood and silence. His brothers Mario and Ralph were soldiers in the same outfit. One of them, Mario, was once observed by detectives in cars registered to sanitation companies linked to mob-controlled waste dumps. It wasn't flashy, but it was profitable. The kind of racket that stretched from Ulster County to Staten Island, from toxic landfills to illicit credit unions. In 1985 and 1986, Gigante reportedly held secret meetings connected to the $12 million defrauding of Brooklyn's hyphen credit union scandal involving fake taxi meter sales and falsified loans. He was the maestro of the unseen deal, the man behind the curtain, the wizard of New York's criminal underground. And yet, when the FBI came knocking, what they found was a naked man in a running shower, shielding himself with an umbrella. Gigante's criminal resume went back decades. As a teenager, he was a boxer, 21 wins in 25 fights. By 17, he was already known to police. Weapons, gambling, bookmaking. But it was in 1957 that he truly stepped out of the shadows, when a bullet grazed the scalp of Frank Costello, the old boss of bosses. The man who pulled the trigger? According to Joseph Valachi and federal records, Vincent Gigante. Though acquitted at trial, thanks to Costello's famous "I didn't see nothing," the message was received. Costello retired, Genovese took over, and the kid who shot the king became the prince. Over time, he rose: bodyguard, chauffeur, consigliere. Then, in the early 1980s, with the decline of Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno, he became the boss. By 1985, he was the undisputed king of the Genovese family. But he didn't rule with guns. He ruled with whispers, walkabouts, and weathered bathrobes. Some say he was insane. Others say he was a genius. But everyone in the underworld knew one thing. If you wanted peace in New York, if you wanted a dispute settled, if you wanted permission to move, you asked the Chin. And if he said nothing, that was your answer. By the summer of 1985, while the federal heat pressed down on the Mafia like never before, squeezing the 5 families through trials, wiretaps, and a crumbling code of silence, another game was playing out in the margins. It wasn't played with guns or gambling slips, but with lab coats, environmental buzzwords, and a mysterious compound called K20. On paper, K20 was just a chemical decontaminant, a cleaner for toxic spills. But in the hands of Meade Esposito, Brooklyn's former Democratic kingmaker, it became a Trojan horse for influence, access, and, if prosecutors were right, corruption. By his side stood Frederick Giovanelli, a reputed Genovese family soldier with deep ties to the family's elusive acting boss, Vincent the Chin Gigante. Together, they weren't trying to muscle bookmakers or skim construction sites. They were trying to corner the market on municipal cleanup, one zoning board, one handshake at a time, and Long Island was the target. From a bugged office in Farmingdale, federal agents listened in as Esposito and his associate, Harry Dickron, spun a web that stretched across party lines. Recorded conversations hinted at quiet lunches, backroom deals, and favors traded not for envelopes of cash, but for a piece of the action. The players mentioned weren't street enforcers or maid guys. They were local party bosses, town officials, and planning commissioners. Men like Joseph Margiotta, Suffolk GOP boss William Michael Blake, Babylon honcho Edmund Marino, and Babylon's former supervisor, Anthony Noto. Some denied knowledge, others went silent, but the tapes told a story. The heart of the scheme was chilling in its simplicity. Introduce K20 to municipalities under the guise of an innovative, environmentally safe product. Then nudge compliant officials to authorize its use. No need for guns. Just introductions, influence, quiet pressure. And, if necessary, a sliver of the profits. One conversation captured by a federal bug laid it bare. Dikran told GOP official Robert Curcio that his associate was a wise guy. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. This wasn't just about chemicals. This was about Cosa Nostra wrapping itself in a green cloak, trying to turn hazardous waste into a revenue stream. And they would have gotten away with it, if not for Chin. Unbeknownst to Esposito and Dikran, their partner Giovanelli was under a separate surveillance net cast by the FBI's Genovese family probe. Investigators had tapped Giovanelli's phone at his Queens home and quickly realized their bug was catching more than just mob whispers. On August 27, 1985. The very first day the wire went hot, agents heard Giovanelli discussing K20 with Dikran. From there, the FBI followed the chemicals trail like blood spatter at a crime scene. Wiretaps at Beaumont Offset Corporation, bugs in Esposito's Brooklyn and Quogue homes, surveillance of lunch meetings, it was all swept up. The feds had stumbled into a multi-pronged investigation: bribery, extortion, zoning kickbacks, money laundering, loan fraud, and political corruption. The chemical was just the beginning. K20 wasn't just a product. It was a portal, a window into how the Genovese family, operating under Gigante's shroud of madness, was evolving. In the end, no Long Island officials were directly charged in the K20 affair. Many denied involvement. Some had their names floating without proof. But the investigation led to other dominoes falling. Esposito and Congressman Mario Biaggi were later convicted in unrelated corruption cases. Dozens of other probes blossomed from the original K20 trail, each one a thread pulled from a larger tapestry of criminal infiltration. And in the shadows, Gigante remained untouchable, whispering in the alleys, strolling under umbrellas, letting his lieutenants carry out his quiet revolution, not with bullets, but with binders and business cards.